I mean, I think one that's actually, there's a pretty good like
That's
video
just
essay
racism.
about this out there on YouTube is when Spielberg made Indiana Jones. It's almost a parody of Nazis, Nazism. And you have to think about how he, as like a Jewish film director, is using humor as a way to address kind of like a previous like a tragedy that happened to his people and it's like it. I guess timing is one aspect of it, right? Because this is definitely like the way it treated Nazis in the movie was almost like comic book villains, right? Like they were almost cartoonish in how they were, portrayed. And but then like at the end of the movie, like it has like their faces like melting off, right? It's like a literal like act of God, and like the almost like surreal aspect to it. I guess it's just like it's part of like it kind of denotes like a certain stage in the kind of like cultural processing of an event when you transform like these people who like hurt you into like these cartoons as like the people that you tell them in like bedtime stories to like scare your kids at night, right? Like it's like like
yeah,
these,
the processing,
like the boogeyman's, right?
mm-hmm.
Right, like these, like like for a long time, like the Nazis were just like you could just they were just seen as like like pure evil and like they were always regarded as that. But then in like when you get to like Indiana Jones, it's like they're still seen as evil, but the brand is changed from like the like the despicable, like unspeakable kind of horror type of evil to like where where the cartoon villains were trying to steal like the lost artifact,
Right.
like right. The portrayal is changing.
So do you think being able to make these terrible things, terrible events into jokes, I guess these evil people into clowns, do you think that's a good thing? I mean, I feel like there also needs to be a healthy, kind of constructive textbook or, education alongside that, because then people just kind of joke about Nazis and they won't know the full gravity of how evil they were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Indiana Jones was like a good example of how to do it in a way that was still like that was able to incorporate humor, but was still like overall respectful and kind of yeah, basically respectful of history and like not actually yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a fine line to go along, but like I think that's an example where it's done well.
Yeah.
Here's what I was gonna ask. So here's an interesting thing. Japanese people really don't joke about history. There's no dark humor, right? But in the States, all the young teenagers, they joke about it's bad, but they joke about, the wars, 9/11. There's a lot of political satire. There's a lot of jokes about history. But in Japan, you can't joke about World War II. You can't joke about the terrorism that happened in the with the Aum religious group. You can't joke about any of these terrible events, which is, I mean, it's understandable. Also, it's like making these into jokes, I feel like it brings it back into the topic. People can talk about it because people joke about it. And if people understand that it's a joke and people understand that it's a way of kind of bringing it back into the mainstream conversations, I feel like it's a good thing, but Japan doesn't really do that. So do you guys agree with me that it's a good thing that you can joke about historical events?
I think it's actually a really interesting question because I'm wondering now what kind of like joking about a historical event kind of functions as. And I think it almost always is kind of reaffirming some kind of value position on a specific thing. I mean, like joking about, I guess, an analogous thing would be like the Jonestown kind of cultish group. Like people joke about that, drink the Kool-Aid. That people say that all the time. And I think there is an unfortunate degree to which it might kind of, to people who just are kind of unaware of like what really happened, and they kind of just like know the joke, like there obviously runs the risk of people who just in a unproductive way don't really know the history of it. But I think you're right in that it definitely destigmatizes talking about a lot of these things. And yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting to think about. In a way, it's like, yeah, we have less compassion for the people in the past because we are always more comfortable, like turning tragedies that happened decades ago, 100 years ago, into something that's funny. Right. Like it kind of,
But the hard thing is basically you have to kind of see who's in the room, right? Because let's say we can joke about the atomic bomb, but then there's someone who's from Hiroshima whose relatives are affected, right? So basically, what's hard is that how do you distinguish when to make these jokes and who to make these jokes to? Like, think about it, making a black joke in front of a black friend. What about that? Is that, it's
like
hard.
always bad. It's always bad to say an insensitive joke, but we just don't care most of the time, and the people around you don't care most of the time. It's totally political. It's completely political. It's like socio-political. Like what kind of jokes about history you make, it depends on what room you're in, and I think in America, at least, because it is such a more politicized place, probably I'm kind of guessing than Japan, just because like we have a lot more like very vocal and very prominent polarization in our country. Then you have historical jokes acting as like kind of social cachet, and like kind of this is how I feel about this thing through a joke form, which is always a popular communication format.